Hello folks, regular viewers of my channel will know that I like to do a review of every World of Warcraft patch to take a look at what works for me, what doesn't, and what opportunities I see for the World of Warcraft development team to learn and hopefully improve their offerings. I usually release these 2 to 3 weeks after a patch's launch, when I've had enough time to get a good handle on how the patch's content is playing out on live. But with the patch 11.15 content being so spread out, yes, I will use the word time-gated. For this patch, I decided to wait until I'd been able to experience the patch in its entirety. Now, while the original patch announcement did imply that not all of the content would be arriving in day one, I think that very much fell under the community's radar, and when Blizzard announced the final schedule a couple of weeks before the patch went live, it got a pretty immediate and negative reaction from the community. As someone who plays most, if not all, of the game's PvE content, I personally was okay with the idea of spreading the content out over time. The thought of having a big open world event, along with horrific visions and Dastardly Duos to farm all at the same time, and coming on top of the Undermine Cartel rep farms which are still ongoing, it did feel to me like it would have been a bit overwhelming. Which meant that I personally appreciated the idea that visions would likely be landing around about when I'd be finishing up with the Nightfall event. That said, I did see where the community was coming from. Time gating, and I'm specifically using that word to mean the bad type of time gating, that which harms the experience of content by trying to spread it far too thin, has been a major issue for World of Warcraft and the community, most notably in the way it was misused in the Legion through to Shadowlands era max level campaign storylines. And a negative community reaction to the merest hint of time gating is very much to be expected. So much so that I do think that Blizzard should have anticipated this reaction. Had the developers, instead of announcing that Horrific Visions and Dastardly Duos would be part of patch 11.15, announced them as part of a bonus 11.16 patch that they dropped between 11.15 and 11.17, instead of that backlash, we'd probably have been commending them for their flexibility and willingness to drop extra bonus content on us. But anyway, let's get into the patch itself. The patch launched with just 2 major features, the Nightfall event and the Cooldown Manager. We did not know it at the time, but the Cooldown Manager is the very first step of a long-term plan by the Blizzard developers to reduce our reliance on combat add-ons by providing alternatives to those popular add-ons which are very likely in the future to be broken by the introduction of increased restrictions on what game information add-ons get access to. The Cooldown Manager is inspired by the very popular head-up display weak order packs such as those made by Luxos or Athenar, which display our major abilities and proc cooldowns prominently in screen. When I heard about this new feature, I thought it sounded like a great idea, and I was very much looking forward to being able to delete many of the weak order packs, at least from my alt. Unfortunately, that was not to be. The biggest single issue with the Cooldown Manager is a lack of customizability, meaning that you basically have to accept what the developers decide that we should see on screen and in the way that they decide we should see it. Now, to be fair, I do think that most users of those weak order packs just accept their developers' defaults, so this might have been fine if the Cooldown Manager actually did the same job as those weak order packs. Sadly, for many, if not most classes, that has turned out not to be the case. At best, the Cooldown Manager tends to track far too much, with countdown bars in particular being overused. The end result is often a cluttered experience which leads to visual overload, the very problem that the weak order packs are usually designed to try to solve in the first place. And in the worst case, for several classes and specializations, the developers made some very odd decisions about what to track and what not to track. Feedback about these problems was provided to Blizzard on the PTR, but that simply resulted in what I would characterize as a very defensive response from the development team. The end result is a feature that is difficult to use at best, and at worst detracts from the overall experience of the game. Small wonder then that, as far as I can see, it's a feature that has not been very well received by the community. And the greatest irony of all? there is now an add-on which adds the missing ability to customize it. Content-wise, we got the Nightfall open world event. This was very clearly inspired by the very successful Time Rifts event from patch 10.15, with a 10-step renown track to incentivize us to do the event on a more regular basis than the smaller scale open world events, which often tend to become a weekly to-do list thing. Sadly, the launch day experience of the event was marred by some very serious game-breaking bugs, with both individual objectives and the final boss regularly failing to spawn. Bugs are nothing new in an MMO patch launch, but with this event being the sole playable content, these issues pretty much made players feel like the whole patch was just entirely broken. And Blizzard's response to this issue was to adopt their characteristic silence, with the only responses coming from obviously out of the loop customer service representatives in the forum. And to this day, despite game director Ian Hazzikostas admitting to a PC Gamer journalist that the release was not acceptable, it has not occurred to a single member of the Blizzard team to apologise to their paying customers. While the event did gradually get better, it took just over a week for it to fully stabilise and allow me to get a handle on how it felt as an actual gameplay experience. And while the event shared much of the design DNA of Time Rifts, it sadly lacks the main component that made those Time Rifts so good, which was depth and variety. Time Rifts has 6 different themes along with associated end bosses, and those themes would be paired together in single Time Rifts in different ways to offer a deep pool of different activities to do, which, thanks to some clever use of RNG, meant that every Time Rift felt very different, with those individual objectives taking multiple events before you'd encounter them for the second time. While many of the individual objectives in Nightfall are quite different, those objectives tend to come up in at least every other run of the event, which creates a very strong impression that the pool of individual objectives the event is drawing from is far too shallow. And that feeling is exacerbated by most runs having far too many players chasing far too few objectives. While this is not an issue with combat-based objectives where we can all burn down the enemy as fast as possible, for those objectives that require us to interact with items in the field, I personally find that I spend most of the time watching someone get to an objective first, and in most cases I'd end up flying around hoping to find an untouched one, which for me at least just wasn't a lot of fun. Reward wise, the event is pretty decent, offering a reliable way to get champion gear for alts and an absolute fire hose of alt catch up gear. Despite having a total of 32 max level alts, yes I know that is too many, pretty much all of them now have an almost full set of Season 2 gear. As well as the Nightfall event, we also get a rotating daily quest system, which alternates between Hallerfall and Ashkahet, offering 3 quests each day. But that was the exact same quest. And by that, I don't mean the same 3 different quests each day, but instead we get 3 identical Fill the Bar quests, which ask us to kill Sureki and click on stuff, the only variation from the 3 quests being the things that we click on. I'm genuinely at a loss to understand how this was not spotted during playtesting as a problem. Overall, if you haven't guessed it by now, the Nightfall event was a major disappointment for me, and it appears that Blizzard have somehow completely missed what it was that made Time Rifts a success. Next up was Turbo Boost, which, while technically not a patch 11.15 feature, being more of a Season 2 thing, as it was launched within the patch, I am going to include it here. Turbo Boost saw an increase in the item level cap for hero and myth track gear, along with the introduction of the much anticipated puzzling cartel chips dinar-like system, the removal of the crest upgrade caps and catch-up boost to Delve rewards, along with an increase in Delve's gilded crest cap from 31 to 41 per week. When first announced, the dinar system got a lot of community pushback, mainly due to myth track rewards being limited to people who had killed the item's respective raid boss in mythic difficulty, something that only a tiny proportion of players do. This left the majority of players being limited to hero track versions. And if you're a Mythic Plus player or even a Delver who's been buying max rank crafted gear, the end result was rewards that were likely an item level downgrade. something that feels bad even if the item is technically better. The end result was to leave most players feeling decidedly left out of the system. To their credit, the Blizzard developers did respond, adding Mythic Plus items to the dinar system. But that came with the requirement of having timed all Mythic Plus dungeons on a plus 12 or above in order to buy the Mythic versions. While this is an improvement, it has still left players who do Mythic Plus 10s and 11s, which happens to be the majority of Mythic Plus players, in a weird no man's land, stuck with those item level downgrades. And for those who do Mythic Plus 12s, with the Mythic Plus rewards being limited to trinkets only, and the new system allowing us to buy 3 items, and items like the heroic Jaster's Diamond for the raid beating myth track items, the end result is a system that very much feels rushed and undercooked. And given how anticipated the feature was, that's ended up overshadowing the whole Turbo Boost event. And this is something that is a bit of a shame. You would not think that adding extra upgrade steps to hero and mythic track items, effectively raising the item level cap by 7 levels, would be a big deal. But with this addition coinciding with the removal of the crest cap, allowing us to freely upgrade the many lower level crests that we have collected over the start of the season, this resulted in a significant power boost, one that proved to be an enabling factor for many players who were still working on their Mythic Plus goals. The end result was a significant spike in player engagement. I don't think I've ever seen Donegal be so busy on a reset day, and a large spike in Mythic Plus participation, especially at the plus 12 level, with folks pushing for those better dinar rewards, or even just to get their Keystone Legend mounts. And on the delve front, seeing an increase in the amount of gilded crests has opened up the option for delvers to invest a lot more into crafted gear as a way to push themselves beyond the limits of the heroic gear cap. Overall, for me, the Turbo Boost feature has been a bit of a success, and it's one that I hope Blizzard will commit to continuing in future seasons, albeit with a little bit of investment into improving the dinar system to ensure it better meets the needs of all players and not just the privileged few. Next to come was Horrific Visions. Now, back in Battle for Azeroth, this was a feature that very much split player opinion. For me, the combination of feeling forced to do them by the need to upgrade my legendary cloak, combined with the limited number of attempts, which created a situation where failing more than 2 or 3 visions would leave you permanently behind for up to 3 months, put so much pressure on my runs that it was impossible for me to enjoy the content. After that experience, I personally did not have very high hopes for the updated visions, but much to my surprise, thanks to the unlimited attempts and ability to just go again if you fail, I found myself farming runs to get the new head enchant and mounts. It turns out that removing the overdone compulsion and limited access of Battle for Azeroth, combined with a more interesting and engaging reward setup, has for me transformed the content and let it realise a potential that I guess the people who did enjoy it back in BFA had somehow managed to find. And this success was very fortunate, because the visions did though have a major issue. With the negative pre-launch feedback and Timegating, I would have liked to have thought that with the 1 month wait for the visions to launch, Blizzard would have taken that feedback on board and removed the internal Timegating that was present in the new visions upgrade console. Sadly, that was not to be. And in an example of what I can only describe as Battle for Azeroth era stubbornness, the Vision upgrade console unlocks were spread out over a total of 4 weeks. As you can imagine, that has not been a popular decision with just about anyone in the player base. As I mentioned earlier, I did think that there was some merit in spreading out the release dates of the major patch features, but layering on additional internal Timegating into those events is in my view a textbook example of bad Timegating. In week 1 of the Horrific Visions, we were able to earn 4 unlocks for the upgrade tree, which happened to exactly match the number of talents that were available to be chosen, leaving us with nothing more than an illusion of choice. To make matters worse, the tree's user interface gave no explanation why the second row of the tree could not be selected. This of course meant that if you were a player who did not read World of Warcraft or follow World of Warcraft content creators, it ended up being a very confusing and broken feeling experience. Thankfully, the tuning of the visions meant that it was possible for most people to achieve all but the most challenging high mask runs, even without the rest of the upgrade tree. So while this internal time gating was a bad experience, it wasn't a game-breaking one, and overall I do consider the relaunch of Horrific Visions to be a bit of a surprise success, and I suspect that for many players it has proven to be the one highlight of the patch. And finally we get to the final event, Dastardly Duos. The original announcement made this sound a bit like a Brawlers Guild 2.0. This, I think, was a very dangerous impression. The Brawlers Guild is one of the most beloved features in World of Warcraft, and one that players regularly ask Blizzard to bring back, and that risks creating an impossibly high bar for the feature to live up to. Dastardly Duos, however, is a very different piece of content. So much so that I do think it did manage to avoid being compared too much with the Guild. As a content feature, it has a ton of really good ideas. It offers a multi-layered build your own difficulty system that allows us to use power buffs or even debuffs to seamlessly modify the challenge, combined with even more dynamic systems where we can drag bosses into rings to make them harder or back out again if that gets too spicy. The bosses themselves are drawn from dungeon encounters of the past, allowing experienced players to revisit old fights and new players to experience them for the first time. And in addition to the usual mounts, gear and achievements, the event uses a 1980s or early 90s style high score system, allowing us to retry encounters to push our scores upwards. With all of that, the event certainly offered a lot of potential, and on the PTR testing, the fights were simple but very fast paced and anarchic feeling. So was it able to live up to that potential? One issue with the high score system on the PTR was that player gear had a major impact on the scores, and to level the playing field when the feature went live, our gear was scaled down to 619, something that I think was a perfectly reasonable decision. Sadly though, that decision, plus I suspect some retuning of the event, greatly slowed down the encounters, and this exposed a bit of a major issue. Those old dungeon bosses aren't very mechanically complex, and this combined with a lack of threat from the mechanics resulted in the bosses turning into very straightforward damage sponges. The end result to me was encounters that just don't feel very engaging. As a tank, even solo with the followers, the enemies don't really challenge me, and as a non-tank, the inability to control where the tank NPC stands prevents me from engaging in the mechanics to adjust the encounter difficulty. The experience of group play, even as a duo or trio, is a bit better. Being able to mess about with a couple of mates does give an hour or so of fun, but even there, that lack of depth in the encounters does make them quickly pall. Rewards wise, while the high score system is a great idea, the lack of any player ladders, shared high scoreboard, or score based rewards beyond a weekly score target achievement, when combined with veteran track gear drops, which thanks to the Nightfall event's gear fire hose feels kinda pointless, it all means that once that hour or so of fun wears out, there just doesn't feel like there's any reason to keep going. To make matters worse, the main cosmetic rewards come from a series of weekly quests, and with those quests only requiring us to do one Dastardly Duo encounter to complete, this long tail just ends up feeling like a time-gated weekly chore, and it's one that represents a case study in how misuse of time-gating can severely damage otherwise potentially very good content. Overall, patch 11.15 feels to me like the World of Warcraft development team was experimenting both with content but how to pace out the content. And I think it's fair to say that that experiment has delivered the team with a lot of lessons in how not to develop a World of Warcraft patch. The most obvious lesson for the team to learn is that excessive time gating just does not work at all for the World of Warcraft player base. But for me, there is also another lesson for the team as well. And that's the importance of having enough depth in each of the individual bits of content. The one factor that made Horrific Visions a success in this patch was its depth, both in gameplay and combat mechanics, but also in its reward design. In contrast, for both Nightfall and Dynamic Duos, that factor that made both of those fall a little flat for me was a lack of depth, be it in the lack of different objectives in the Nightfall event, or just the lack of depth in combat and rewards for Dynamic Duos. I cannot help but wonder that if instead of patch 11.15 attempting to have 3 major event-based content features, it had perhaps just had 1 or 2 of them, then that might have enabled the development team to invest a little bit more in building out the missing depth. Dynamic Duos was so close to being a major success if only it had been given a little bit more time and attention on the combat and rewards design front to help push it over the finishing line. And to wrap up, I do have one last bit of direct feedback for the World of Warcraft development team. The current level of quality in the Dragonflight and War Within patch releases, and I am specifically talking about the game-breaking bugs here, is falling below what we players should reasonably expect from a premium priced game like World of Warcraft, and this has been going on without improvement for far too long now. And specifically aiming at the World of Warcraft team's leadership, your unwillingness to acknowledge and apologise for these issues, except when it's forced from the game director by professional journalists, is being heard loud and clear by at least this player. And I would encourage you all to reflect if it is the kind of message you really want to be sending out to us. And that's it for my patch 11.15 review. It's certainly been a bit of a bumpy ride, albeit not a complete washout. And I'd be super interested to hear all of your thoughts too. What parts of the patch did you enjoy and which were the misses? Let us all know in the comments down below. And if you found this update helpful, entertaining, or even just plain annoying, then do let me know by hitting that like icon. And if you want to support my channel to grow and help me make more of these videos along with my other content, then do hit that subscribe button right now before you forget. And if you don't want to miss out whenever I release a new video, then as well as subscribing, you can follow me on social media. My link's in the description below as well. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.